Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. I'm LaShawn Jefferson, the Senior Executive Director here at Perry Worldhouse, Penn's Hub for Global Engagement. So wonderful to see a full audience here on Locust Walk, and I imagine there's a very full audience online. We'd like to start this program with a couple of housekeeping. So as you all know, our programs are nothing without audience participation. There will be a mic, or rather there is a mic stage right. Later on in the program, you will be encouraged to go to the mic and ask questions. Questions should be succinct and should end with a question mark. For those of you who are online, as you well know, you can drop a question in the Q&A function within Zoom. We also have a chat function within Zoom for those of you who are online, and we will be dropping resources as they are mentioned throughout the program, and we will be looking at and monitoring that site for any technical difficulties. We also have closed captioning online, which can be activated and deactivated. And as usual, we do these weekly conversation series as an opportunity for everyone to learn. For those of you who are in the audience here in Locust Walk, and for those of you who are online, please participate to learn, which means really approaching these programs with a very open mind. With that, we will begin our formal program. Welcome to today's edition of The World Today, which will feature Penn's very own Scott Moore, who is here to discuss his latest book, China's Next Act, in which he argues that China will have a major role to play in meeting shared global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and the rise of new technologies like artificial intelligence. He'll discuss how collective challenges and global goals are shaping international relations with China, both through competition and through cooperation. We have a full house and we're just putting up a few more chairs. I'll just wait a second to get that done. There are at least 2 chairs up front if people want to grab them. Our conversation will be moderated by Regina Abrami, who is the Chang Sun Term Professor and Faculty Director of the Global Program at the Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies at Penn, with appointments in departments of political science and management. She is a multi-year recipient of Wharton Teaching Award for her course on China and global business. Her areas of expertise broadly include international and comparative political economy, with a special focus on China, geoeconomics, industrial policy, and international business. She is also the esteemed co-leader of Perry Worldhouse's Graduate Associates Program. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guests to the stage.
On here? Yeah, okay, good. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for taking time from your busy days to join us today for what I hope is going to be a dynamic conversation on China's Next Act. I understand that our author actually knows what that will be. So I think without further ado, I'm going to turn over the floor to Dr. Scott Moore to just take about 5-6 minutes to tell us a bit about the book and your sort of opening remarks, and then we'll move to Q&A.
Thanks so much, Regina. Thanks to you all for coming. And it's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to share with you some things that I learned, some things I came to believe, and certainly a couple questions I still have from researching and writing this book. I'm going to turn in a little bit to telling you a little bit more about why I wrote it. But I want to also say that it's a particular pleasure for me to be able to be here at Perry Worldhouse, because Perry Worldhouse and the Penn community played a really important role in my thinking that I try to express in the book, and in particular, the key kind of challenge or dilemma that the book is really about. And that's that our future, both here at Penn in Philadelphia, in the United States, and the world at large, is increasingly shaped by shared challenges, especially as I'll get to in the 2 areas of sustainability and emerging technologies. And yet we're facing that future amidst a backdrop of growing geopolitical tension and rivalry between many of the major powers in the world, but most especially the United States and China. And that's really the kind of core issue that I try to explore in the book, is how to reconcile that basic tension and how to make some progress on addressing shared global challenges, even against this backdrop of growing rivalry and competition. I'm also a pretty big fan of the bottom line up front. So I'll try to give it to you now. And it's that we have to rethink China's role in the world and U.S. policy and the policy of other countries with respect to China, principally in terms of these two issues, sustainability on the one hand and emerging technologies on the other. But that we have to do that by thinking not just about cooperation and not just about working together through cooperative means, but also through competition, both economic, geopolitical, and ideological. And of course, we'll talk more about all aspects of that.
Thank you so much, Scott. So I believe that you already are familiar with the format, but we're going to chat for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'm going to turn it over to you for Q&A. And it's good to see many of you have a copy of the book in your hand as well. This book, I think what's really distinguishes it is that it covers a wide range of topics. So each of the chapters really, I think, cover the areas where the world has its focus on China. So issues of emerging technologies, public health, digital security, information, as well as human resources. And so these are all big focal areas for discussions today about China's rise, but also how whatever it is that China does, the rest of the world feels some kind of impact around. So I think what I'd like to do, Scott, to just kick us off is to understand a little bit more about not just why you wrote this book, but who's your target audience for this book?
So my target audience is certainly and hopefully all of you in the room here. But I have to say, if there was one kind of particular audience that I tried to write this book for, it was actually the business community. And that's somewhat strange because I have no background in business, know very little about it. But for reasons that we'll probably go into, I think the business community and the private sector plays a really critical role in addressing shared challenges in these two areas of sustainability and emerging technology, in part because of the growing influence of geopolitical tension that make it harder and more difficult for governments to play the leading role that they should play, frankly, in addressing those areas. So against that backdrop, part of the what I think can fill some of the gap, though not all of it, is the role of the private sector. I'll also say that particularly in an American context, when it comes to relations with China, I think the business community is the natural constituency for a constructive relationship with China and a balanced and nuanced one, which certainly I believe is what we need to be thinking about.
Well, thank you. So I'm glad that you mentioned business, because it is true, at least in the space of environment and climate change, that there were tremendous partnerships. I can think of particularly with GM and some of the other auto manufacturers around collaboration on reducing emissions and working together with their China's counterparts and both government agencies as well. And I know when you were at State, you too were somewhat involved with some of the environmental issues. So there was a very positive, we'll say people to people, but also company to company partnership around what we can call global issues like climate change. But at the same time, with regard to business and particularly American business, if we look at the sentiment in the United States today, it's very hostile to U.S. business, particularly regarding its approach to China, with many arguing that it was because of U.S. businesses' capacity to, I don't want to say buy votes, but certainly win favor in Congress, that many of the concerns with China's rise went unattended because of a large effort at lobbying on the part of U.S. businesses. So how do you balance encouraging U.S. business to sort of bring both sides together while recognizing that if you take that step, there are many on the U.S. side who think that business would be the worst step forward because of their own self-interests that they are going to probably be driven by?
That's a great question, and just by kind of way of framing the answer, it may be worth kind of saying a little bit more about what did kind of motivate me to write this book in the first place. That was an experience that I had in 2015, 2016. That time period is significant for reasons I'll go into in just a second. To serve as something called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Officer on the China desk at the U.S. Department of State. That's the office that handles U.S.-China relations. At the time, that kind of area, that portfolio, as it was called, Environment, Science, Technology, and Health, really became the focus of a lot of the overall action when it came to U.S.-China relations. It was the year leading up to the Paris Agreement on climate change, which was an issue that I spent probably the single biggest portion of my time there focusing on. But it was also a time in which we were coming off of what was at the time thought of as a pretty successful example of U.S.-China cooperation in public health, specifically a joint response to a very serious outbreak of Ebola in West Africa that witnessed some pretty striking scenes that are worth, briefly recounting because they're so hard to imagine today. Literally, you had Chinese People's Liberation Army personnel, engineers unloading supplies that were delivered by the U.S. military and then used to build field hospitals that were used to treat Ebola victims that were staffed by U.S. Military medics. So really pretty striking examples of cooperation that, again, are hard to imagine today. That was only 7 years ago. And my core purpose in trying to write this book is to basically explain why that promise that seemed so vibrant just 7 years ago failed to be realized, and in some ways failed so spectacularly. And also, of course, to try to think about where we go now, given that obviously none of these shared challenges, whether it's pandemic prevention, climate protection, or regulation of emerging technologies, have gone away. They've only intensified. That gets to the answer to your question, Regina, and something I try to go into in the book in terms of explaining why we had this sharp turn and why we haven't had the cooperation in response to shared challenges that seemed possible and certainly desirable at the time, is because of an unfortunate confluence of events. As these shared global challenges became more prominent, more pressing, both for China and the rest of the world, China itself, for lots of reasons, a lot of them economic in nature, decided to double down on some, from a foreign perspective anyway, very problematic policies. And there are three in particular that I talk about in the book: authoritarianism, nationalism, and protectionism, that were used. I mean, they obviously have deep roots in the Chinese political system, but they were chosen as the basis of Beijing's response to these newer challenges in terms of sustainability, in terms of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And unfortunately, that choice of impulses really undermined the prospects for a cooperative approach between the United States, China, and other countries to these shared global challenges. I hasten to add, just as one more point to your question, Regina, that these impulses were not unique to China. And I think from a global perspective, part of why cooperation has failed on shared global challenges so spectacularly over the last decade is because those impulses have been mirrored to some extent elsewhere. However, because China is so important for issues like climate change or pandemic prevention, the salience of those three approaches in the case of China makes it more serious and more problematic.
Thank you. So I think just the three watchwords there that I'm hearing you say are authoritarianism, protectionism, and nationalism, not just on the China side, but really as a global economic downturn occurred, all countries sort of turning to those three, well, not all to authoritarianism, but to at least protectionism and increased nationalism, mostly driven by a desire for self-sufficiency, stability, and continued economic growth. So with that, however, there is a different value system underway. And I was struck in your book how you spend a lot of time talking about the importance of value systems, the liberal value system, what you're calling the authoritarian value system. Is there any way to bring that together, or is that actually what's now standing in the way?
I have a line in the book that goes something to the effect of, I probably should be able to quote my own book, but exactly, but it goes something like, the case of China kind of sharpens a challenge of trying to figure out how you respond to shared threats in the absence of shared values. And it does strike me, and I think to some extent values kind of cut across those three areas or impulses of authoritarianism, nationalism, and protectionism. But I think there is a separate kind of almost normative aspect of if you don't have a certain kind of shared reference point for what the basis of response to climate change or to other kind of public good issues is, it's very difficult to imagine a truly cooperative response. And so examples that I give in going into the book is that China's approach, for example, to environmental protection differs quite a lot from how we think of it in the West and in much of the developed world, where there's a lot of intersection with popular movements. Sort of popular environmentalism is a really key feature of environmental protection and policy in the US. In China, that's largely absent. It's really much more kind of state directed, and people often talk about authoritarian environmentalism as the sort of basis of China's approach. And that does have real consequences when you think about trying to have a climate or energy policy based on a very kind of different set of values from that's implemented elsewhere in terms of building towards a cooperative response at the global level.
Reminds me of that Chinese expression. What is it? Same bed, different dreams. So yeah, so same goal, different ways of getting there. So looking to that specifically, in your book, you spend a good deal of time talking about the importance of non-governmental organizations. And, again, in that context around different values, we have seen China constrain non-governmental organizations significantly, really over the past 5-6 years. So if you were to advise a Chinese government official, were you in that position, regarding the shortcomings of doing so, what is your argument for why, in fact, they need to have that grassroots perspective and allow people-to-people non-governmental connection?
Well, I think there's specifically with respect to environmental protection, one of the key roles that civil society involvement plays in elsewhere in other countries is essentially in keeping governments honest, because frankly, there are often few incentives, economic incentives, to rigorously enforce environmental policies, for example. On the other, and sort of as a related point, civil society pressure often is the key thing that drives governments to adopt stringent environmental policies in the first place. Now, again, China presents sort of an interesting counterpoint to that, where it has in many cases adopted pretty ambitious and stringent environmental and climate policies. What's a little bit less clear is the enforcement and implementation, particularly at local levels. And so I think that's where civil society involvement can be really important. An interesting aspect of China's approach to both environmental protection and NGO and civil society activism more generally has actually been to tolerate historically more autonomous action and activism in the environmental arena specifically, much more so than in other areas, for example. However, that, as you implied, Regina, that space has shrunk very considerably over certainly the last decade since Xi Jinping took power, but very particularly over the last 5 or so years. So there's been much less kind of tolerance for independent civil society or NGO activism. But it does play a really important role, I think, both in China and elsewhere in calling attention to environmental policy and protection failures. And I think if we kind of look down the road to the need to decarbonize economies by the end of this century, probably well before that, actually, from a climate perspective, it's hard for me to see how government policy and regulation keeps up the pace and the ambition that's necessary in the absence of something like that external pressure.
Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I think about the constraining of non-governmental organizations, not just with regard to environment, but with regard to labor and a whole host of other areas, a lot of that was situated around a distrust on the part of the Chinese government of not just the intentions of these organizations, but the role of foreigners within them. And so you speak a little bit about the challenge of having different values but common goals and how to come together. But underneath that as well, it seems to me, is this issue of lack of trust. So today you have a lack of trust on the Chinese side vis-a-vis U.S. government intentions. You do, I believe, also have the same on the Chinese side, a lack of trust of what U.S. intentions are. And we've seen that particularly escalating with regard to Taiwan, but we can see it in all host of issues. So what's the solution there when you have two sides that generally seem not to trust each other? And I'll give you a context for this, because I was a bit struck in your book how you spoke about two areas where we need to see both sides come together. And the one was climate change. And I could easily get my head around, okay, I understand coming together on climate change, but you also spoke about coming together on emergent technologies. And in some sense, the emergent technologies, and here we're thinking of biotech, artificial intelligence, quantum computing and the like, those really have become new battlefronts in some ways. So what is your thinking or perspective on how there is some scope for coming together in those areas when we seem to be in such a state of distrust?
Certainly not easy. And it's really more of a question of it being the most promising approach rather than a promising approach. And let me just say a little bit more. Part of why I place so much importance on kind of non-state sub-state actors, which we've talked about three types of them so far: the private sector, NGO or civil society. Another one I talk about are universities and research institutions. And part of the reason I think that those types of actors are much more important and will become so in the future is not only that it's so difficult to have government to government dialogue on these issues, but also that particularly to some extent in sustainability, but certainly in the emerging tech space, things are just evolving so quickly that governments can't keep up. And so often the de facto regulators, the people making decisions about, should we pursue this path? Should we train our AI this way? Or should we edit this genome? Oftentimes the people making those decisions are individual researchers or at the lab level. Government regulation plays only a very distant kind of role in those decisions, but that's really kind of where the key kind of interface is. And so for that reason too, I think it's really critical to think about this kind of broader set of actors. And as a side point, it always strikes me, particularly when we think about like US-China relations, these are two really big, powerful governments. So I think people tend to automatically leap to thinking about the intergovernmental and diplomatic relationship. But the US-China relationship is much deeper and much broader, and it does encompass the private sector. It encompasses universities, research collaborations, all of that. And I think that's where I see more potential, not necessarily a lot of potential, but more potential for university-led or university-hosted dialogue on things like artificial intelligence norms and standards. And incidentally, some of those conversations not necessarily specific to China, but have taken place right here, in this room. And I think there's a lot of untapped potential for that. I'll just make one more point, which is I think really critical, though. None of this is necessarily a substitute for diplomacy or for government action. At the end of the day, whether it's for climate or for artificial intelligence regulation, ultimately you probably do need some type of binding international agreement, which is going to have to be between nation states, and you're going to have to depend ultimately on nation states to implement it. So it's not a substitute, but given the practical challenges that we have, I think we need to start at the sub-state and non-state level.
Thank you. As I think about this, I guess what China would call people-to-people relations, as a way to move forward, there is then geopolitics and realpolitik. And realpolitik says, weapons are weapons and they have interoperability. The U.S. benefits from being able to set the standards for weapons. It benefits from setting the standards for, telecommunication and whatnot. And China likewise would benefit if it could set those standards, not just in creating markets, but also in making them the preferred seller of particular goods. Likewise, we see in the world today, China saying it really is not an expansionary power. It is frequently made that comment, but we also do see it expanding military bases. I believe it now has 2, 3, and then, however many ports. And so you have this juxtaposition, I think, of where China is saying one thing, but the world sees it doing another thing. So if you were to wake up tomorrow as a private advisor to Xi Jinping, what would you tell him to do differently?
Not sure I would take that job, but okay. So I think there are two major points to your question that I would emphasize. One is part of the argument that I make in the book is that a lot of the kind of traditional areas in U.S.-China relations or sort of Chinese foreign policy that were of concern, political, military issues like Taiwan or human rights issues, are increasingly kind of moving over into or being kind of fused with newer issue areas in both sustainability and technology. So one example is that censorship, for example, and surveillance has, for the most part, moved over almost entirely into the digital domain, in part because so much of our lives, is now digital. Another example is in the case of Taiwan. I mean, the kind of relative military balance is important, but I would say now just as important are the relative cyber capabilities that are available to the United States versus China versus other potential participants in a, God forbid, conflict over Taiwan or elsewhere. The second piece, I think, of what you brought up, Regina, is that to the extent that we're in this kind of game of competition, whether it's economic, geopolitical, ideological, and to the extent that these kind of more traditional tensions are being kind of reshaped by developments in sustainability and emerging technology, the most important things when it comes to winning, competing effectively, tend to be intangible things like norms and standards, like controlling or being able to set the standards that govern 5G, for example, in order to kind of help to guide or dictate that your country's firms are able to be in the most competitive position in deploying this kind of whole new suite of technology. And to the extent that that technology creates new vulnerabilities for surveillance or information control, that you're able to counteract those as a government or as a nation state. So I think there are kind of two parts to that. One is just understanding that a lot of kind of traditional issues and tensions and areas of potential conflict are being reshaped by sustainability and technology. And that once you kind of realize that, rethinking things in those terms leads you to depend more heavily on these sort of intangible things. And in addition to norms and standards, by the way, the other two that I talk about in the book are data and frameworks for data governance and human capital and talent. Those are the really critical sources of competitive advantage.
Thank you for that. So we're going to transition in a few minutes over to you, the audience. So start thinking about those questions now, if you can. Not sure I entirely got an answer to that question around what Xi Jinping should do. So I'm going to kind of push back a little bit based on what you've said, which is that, yeah, if you can set the rules of the game, you're ahead of the game. So is it in China's strategic interest to try to be the rule setter, or is there some middling position of both sides coming together?
Yeah, fair point. I didn't answer the question. So I'll try to. Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the idea of competition is that if you kind of accept that framing and that objective, then yes, it is in China's interest, and it's also in the interest of the United States or other kind of players in this competitive game. Let me just quickly say two other related things. One is that, and I don't mean to be like pedantic about this, but when you talk about China in the United States, and especially in a policy context, people love to talk about competition. Very few people ever kind of define what that means. And so one of the things I try to do in the book is to offer a definition of what that means, especially as it relates to these shared challenges like climate change. And the definition I offer is that it's a mode of interaction, whether it's in terms of trade or exchange or communication, in which there's an expectation that both sides can gain, but the aim is to make sure that your side gains more than the other side. And that's different from cooperation, in which you're having this exchange or this dialogue, but the expectation is that it produces gains that are more or less equitable for both sides. And I think that's a key difference. So you're not saying, you can just, have two countries going off doing their own thing, and that's fine. It's that you still need interaction, you still need communication, you still need trade, you still need dialogue, but there's a different motivation behind it. And incidentally, I think something the United States as a country and the world needs to think a lot more about is that competition is almost always more expensive and more difficult than is cooperation. We've kind of decided, I think, that those costs are worth bearing, whether it's for national security reasons or other things. But I think we need to think much more about the extent of those costs in light of climate and other shared challenges.
So I'm going to ask my last question before I turn it over to the good audience we have here, which is you often hear people say in criticism to the United States and the current shift it's made in its policy positions that the United States government is trying to out-Chinese the Chinese, meaning to say that they are putting in place industrial policy, they are censoring who gets access to certain technologies, they are constraining information flows, they're making it hard to have scholars per se from certain think tanks in China come to the United States. So it's the sort of almost trying to mirror what is understood to be a Chinese approach and trying to match likewise. And then under that umbrella as well, we have decoupling. So now that you've advised Xi Jinping, were you to advise President Biden on this current tact, which is currently being taken from everything from CHIPS Act to Inflation Reduction Act and others that are trying to buttress the competitive edge of the United States vis-a-vis China largely, what would be your reaction response to what's currently in play?
So I think the kind of use of these more restrictive measures, whether it's trade measures or export controls or whatever, I think there are some cases in which they are justified. So one I do talk in the book about is 5G. I think 5G is a type of technology where there are real concerns over the potential for surveillance and information control that do justify some use of kind of protectionist and security-driven policies. But I think that tool needs to be a scalpel, not a sledgehammer or a paintbrush or whatever, kind of the right analogy would be. Whereas, particularly in the US, but increasingly other countries as well, Japan, Germany, the UK, it's the kind of use of protectionism and this sort of idea of really cutting off a lot of ties to China is really becoming like the default policy across a lot of different issue areas. And I think we just have to think very carefully about the costs imposed as a result of that.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. There is a microphone. Would you like everyone to make use of that microphone? So if you have a question, we kindly ask that you raise your hand or just head over to the microphone. And I guess there's a little bit of a queue that'll form. And if you can, following on LaShawn Jefferson's suggestion, keep your question brief so that we can get as many in as possible. Okay, turning to you.
Hello, my name is Kylo, and I'm a second-year MES student, and thank you so much for this talk and this book. My question will be facing the climate change exacerbated water, energy, agriculture crisis in China. Do you think that China today have the ability to cultivate the technology and also human capital to cope with these crises? If not, will they reach out on the sub-national level to reach out to Western countries to cooperate?
Thanks. Such an important question. I'm not sure, but I worry that the answer is no. And I think there are just three kind of quick things I would say. First of all, climate's such a good example of how neither the United States nor any other country can afford to entirely decouple itself from China because of China's role as the world's largest emitter and a critical player in international climate negotiations. The world needs China to provide this critical global public good of climate protection. At the same time, China has this ambitious decarbonization agenda to phase out all CO2, all carbon dioxide emissions on a net zero basis by 2060. If you look at kind of the projections for how you would get there technologically, China has access to about 80% of the technology that would be needed, or rather, access to the technology that would get you to about 80% of decarbonization by the end of the century. But that 20% is that's going to require some considerable breakthroughs. And those types of breakthroughs are the things that historically have depended most on international collaboration in research and development and in open flows of people, ideas, talent, investment. And I think it's a good example of how a closed kind of system approach, which, unfortunately, the US and China are both, seem to be pursuing for different reasons, could have very negative implications from a climate perspective and potentially undermine China's prospects to fully decarbonize by the end of the century.
Thank you.
Hi, Scott. This is Simon from the School of Arts and Sciences. I have two quick questions regarding COP27. One concerns loss and damage. It seems to me that that discourse mostly is concerned Western nations, and I'm wondering, what is China's position? Has China staked out a position with regard to loss and damage? Will China evade that conversation? And then, sort of related, what do you think is China's strategy going into COP27? What do they want to achieve?
Absolutely. And thank you, Simon. So COP27, just in case folks aren't aware, is the upcoming annual international climate conference sponsored by the United Nations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. COP stands for Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it's the big annual confab on climate issues. Basically. So, okay, a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned that there are a few things I came to believe while writing this book. One of them is that of the world's large economies, China is probably the single most exposed to climate risks. And one striking example of that that we saw just this past summer is that China was subject to the most intense heat wave in the meteorological record, both in terms of its intensity, its duration, and the number of people and area affected. In other words, by almost any measure. And it was such a severe heat wave combined with a very severe drought that, according to at least one estimate, the drag on China's GDP growth this year will be about 0.6%. In terms of the growth rate. That's pretty substantial given that the overall growth rate is estimated to be about 3.5%. And there are reasons, to go into that, but suffice it to say, China has a huge adaptation challenge and adaptation imperative, as well as a mitigation challenge and imperative. And I think that's a critical kind of aspect of thinking about China's role in climate change overall. I think it's probably been underestimated in terms of foreign views of what drives China's climate policy. It's just that sense of risk and vulnerability and the need to adapt. In terms of China's kind of global adaptation agenda, it's been pretty muted and multilateralized. So China has historically been one of the leading countries in the G77 caucus of developing countries in the climate negotiations. China has kind of staked out a little bit of a different role and position with respect to mitigation, but on the adaptation side, that very much remains China's sort of orientation. And so it's very much a multilateral, push for G77 priorities when it comes to adaptation. And essentially, it's rich country financing for more adaptation. And loss and damage agenda is sort of a part and parcel of that. I do think adaptation is probably the area in which I can see most potential for other countries, particular wealthier nations, to engage China to try to convince Beijing to be more ambitious in its adaptation financing commitments. And I think and hope that there's, some greater thinking about that. Last point, which is relevant, I think, to the question about climate. Of course, technically speaking, U.S.-China climate cooperation remains suspended in the aftermath of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan back in August. So a great example of why we need to think about how to make progress through competition as well as cooperation. I think adaptation could hopefully be part of that.
Thank you, Professor Moore. This is Lily, and I'm an MBA student from the Wharton School. This is more like forward-looking. I'm wondering, what's your view on how the kind of the zero tolerance COVID policy in China and a potentially economically weakened China because of that would change its policy in terms of sustainability?
This is a really good question. And I think it's sort of separable into short and long term. In the long term, probably, hopefully not much. In the short term, there's much greater concern and reason to believe that it might. And in fact, one of the things that you've seen, so the decarbonization commitment was made by Xi Jinping himself in 2020. And one of the things that's been really striking since then is that both China's leaders rhetorically and in terms of policy measures, they've kind of prevaricated over how ambitious the timeline on that commitment looks. So in particular, about 18 months or so ago, China had a pretty severe energy supply crisis that prompted some directives from the top to provincial local governments, basically saying balance out kind of energy efficiency measures and energy conservation measures with the necessity of securing supply. That kind of being, a contradiction basically between wanting to keep the lights on and reducing energy use overall and sort of relying more on renewables. And I think economic weakness can be, I think actually even more so than weakness, we're probably looking at just prolonged stagnation. Not that that's much better, but I think it probably looks more like stagnation than sort of declines, real declines overall. That probably will increase pressure to keep kicking the can down the road when it comes to implementing deep emissions cuts. And one thing that is important to kind of note is that China has yet to achieve its maximum emissions, its so-called peak emissions. It's committed to doing so before 2030. So the idea is that China's emissions may continue to increase until some point before 2030, and then they will begin to decline. But the absolute path between that peak and decarbonizing by the end of 2060 isn't clear, and it matters a lot actually when that peak is reached. Because China's emissions make up such a huge fraction of the global total. When that peak is reached and what the slope of the curve looks like after that matters a lot in terms of the prospect of staying below 2 degrees Celsius of average temperature increase globally.
Thank you. Next, Gabby.
Thank you, Professor Moore. My name is Gabby. I'm an undergrad in the Huntsman program. And I was wondering about the area of clean tech. You mentioned that your target audience is business. So for investors, for big money managers looking to place their funds in clean technology, do you think this is an area of competition or cooperation? Is this one where the US should focus on building its domestic capacity and beating China, or one where we should focus on working together and investing together?
More so the latter. And I'll say a quick word about why. There are two examples that strike me as being good ones for where competition might be good for the planet. And one is clean technology development. And one of the reasons I think it could be good for the planet, and I emphasize not necessarily what I think would be the first best option. It's kind of more of a pragmatic argument in light of tensions, disagreements, fundamental differences in values. I think it's just a little more realistic to think about how to pursue shared goals through competition rather than cooperation. But that being said, I think clean tech is an example of where that can be beneficial, and it's for the following reason. I mentioned that in China's case, and this holds roughly globally, you can get about 80% of where we need to go in terms of decarbonization using existing technologies. We just need to have a lot more of them. They need to be better integrated. We need more policy support. They need to become a little bit more efficient, certainly cheaper, but we basically have, the technology. But then there's that 20% that requires a lot more basic research and development. And if you get into like where we are now with our emissions trajectory and where we want to be from a sort of like don't wreck the planet perspective, We're probably going to need more negative emissions technology as we get toward the end of the century, which is basically finding ways to pull more carbon out of the air than we put into it. That's all to say that kind of new generation of technology isn't developed or commercialized yet. And that means it's going to need more investment, including from governments, and especially from governments for reasons we can go into. And for that reason, I think to the extent that competition motivates governments to invest more in clean tech research and development, it can be good for the planet. And I'll just give you one quick example of kind of real world, how I think that can play out. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is, really the only, well, certainly the most meaningful investment the U.S. has made in clean energy and clean technology so far. In his message to Congress saying, if you pass this bill, I will sign it, President Biden specifically referred to the potential of the bill and the need for the bill to equip the United States to compete more effectively with China. So, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best reason to invest in clean technology, but under the circumstances, if that works, I'll take it. And I think the rest of the world should too.
We have a question from our Zoom audience. So if I can just take that question in, this person's been waiting a while, virtual person, and then come right back to you, sir. Okay, sure. So this question is, are you ready? Okay. It has been well documented that within China, some top-down mandates can lead to obfuscation and hiding shortcomings at the local level. So given the 2060 goals and the need for local cooperation and honesty, how is this going to happen?
Okay, so this is a good question, and it does give me the opportunity to mention that there are some conceptual reasons why I think it's interesting and valuable to look at sustainability issues alongside emerging technologies. And one of them is the potential for the marriage of artificial intelligence and satellite remote sensing to enable very precise measurement of greenhouse gas emissions. This is important because historical concern for China's emissions has been reporting how accurate are measurements of China's greenhouse gas emissions, particularly at the provincial and firm level, where it really matters for implementation. This has been a particular concern for other countries, and in the case of the United States, as in if we sign an agreement on climate change, how do we know that it's going to be abided by? How can we verify that emissions reductions are in fact taking place? Well, we do have some newer technologies that really help to solve that problem in a pretty compelling way. And so I think it's certainly a fair question, but I think that's less of a concern than it used to be.
Thank you, sir.
It costs more to raise, educate, and train people here in the U.S. than in many of our competing economies, and that's probably particularly true also in China, relative to China. Do you think the U.S. is going to develop a competitive, in a Ricardian sense, disadvantage in production of human capital? And how would you approach that? What do you think the implications are?
So, this is a question that's, people have been asking for a long time, for several decades. And I think kind of to a lot of people's surprise, the answer has so far been no. But I think it's also the kind of thing that it's a prospect that's very open to self-inflicted wounds. And I would say that from a political perspective, we seem to be doing our best to inflict those. In terms of just the failure to have a reasonable immigration policy and in some, I think, really unfortunate, kind of decisions, regulations, policies related to higher education. So it's certainly not something I would say is impossible to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And in fact, to date, I would say that the evidence is really amazingly compelling on the other side of the ledger. That a lot of countries, and China may be the best example, but there are others like India, have probably overinvested in higher education and particularly STEM education. And yet the United States has basically reaped most of the benefits of that investment because of the scale of talent outflows historically to the United States. Correct. Yep. And it's really, frankly, in spite of everything. But it's a massive contributor, I would say, both to U.S. economic competitiveness, but just overall, if you want to be very, kind of reductionist about it, kind of national power or national strength that very few people think about or focus on.
Yes, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Natsu, and I'm an undergrad student studying computer science. And my question was about China's decreasing population in the long run and how that affects China's strategies in technology and the green climate, and also how that affects the relative advantage of China compared to the US and other countries in the long run.
That's a really good question. And one of the reasons that I do think it's important to look at kind of the emerging technology side of things in the context of kind of global public goods and shared global challenges is that one thing that really distinguishes China, particularly among developing countries, is the amount of resources that the state and that the government has invested in innovation and science and technology. There are two main reasons for that. One is military modernization. It's always been a key objective for, kind of deeply rooted historical reasons for the Chinese Communist Party. But the other is kind of essentially demographic and macroeconomic. For China's economy to continue to grow in light of several challenges, but among them is demographics. China has to become a much more innovative economy and has to generate a lot more value from innovation. I hasten to say one other thing about that. There are many different types of innovation. There's kind of breakthrough innovation, which is what we tend to think of. It's, the iPhone, the internet, things like that, which just sort of totally change the game, create whole new sectors. Most innovation is much more mundane and much more marginal. It's process innovation. It's figuring out how to do things more efficiently, more effectively. And historically, China's been stronger on that side of the innovation equation than the sort of breakthrough sort. But increasingly, that kind of focus on breakthrough technologies, artificial intelligence, things like that, has become a bigger policy objective for China, and has been one reason why technology has become seen as more of an area of competition, because those are the same technologies where the U.S. and other advanced economies see future growth coming from.
So we have one question here from Zoom land, but before we take that one, let me have you go ahead.
Thanks. Scott, thanks for being with us today. My name is Ayo. I'm a graduate student in public policy, and I'm also a graduate associate here at Perry Worldhouse. So kind of on the topic of demography, my question was about China's rural development policy, where they've proven to be pretty good at developing their rural areas and populations, where the United States is still struggling to bring shared economic prosperity to rural areas. It's deeply, deeply concentrated, like along the coast and in particular sectors. So in the past 4 or 5 decades, if China has proven to be pretty good at its rural development, then my question is in these conversations around collaboration or competition, does the US actually have a lot to learn from China in the context of bringing, shared prosperity in the context of sustainability and technology to our rural areas?
So I think that's really appreciate that question. And I think the short answer is yes, to a large degree. One kind of reflection that I think speaks to that. I had a chance to take part in a virtual congressional delegation. It was congressional staff from the United States. Unfortunately, we didn't actually travel to China. We just held Zoom meetings every Wednesday night for a month with Chinese counterparts. But one of the things that really struck me, and it was meant to be a bipartisan delegation, so a lot of the staff from the Republican members of Congress tended to be from more rural states. And one thing that came up as a kind of, to me, striking point of commonality in discussions with Chinese interlocutors was the challenge of employment transition related to decarbonization and the energy transition. In other words, people whose jobs fundamentally depend in one way or another on a fossil fuel-based economy, and how you support people transitioning out of that. So I think there are, certainly a lot of shared challenges in terms of that kind of shared broad-based prosperity. And your question is also interesting because rhetorically speaking, that is an interesting commonality that was a considerable theme of Xi Jinping's speech to the 20th Party Congress. Likewise, when you hear President Biden speak about growing an economy developing an economy that grows from the middle out, there is a certain amount of overlap conceptually there. I think, though, there are so many challenges in terms of like different national level policy that comes into play in terms of that being like an area for really productive dialogue. I think the kind of differences in shared values come into play there. I would also point out that while I think for the last few years, China's rural development policy has arguably been pretty successful, really the first few decades of reform and opening saw huge chasms generated between rural and urban areas. And China's farmers, for example, were left pretty clearly worse off than their counterparts in South Korea or other fast developing economies at comparable stages of growth. So it's not necessarily been a consistent area of success. One final point that I think is in the work I did on public health, I came across something I thought was interesting, that the kind of the Mao period public health system in China may have been one of the few in history to achieve better outcomes in rural areas than in urban ones. It's apparently almost unprecedented in kind of public health literature worldwide to have achieved better health outcomes in rural areas than in urban ones.
Okay, so we have a question here from Zoomland. Are you ready? It is, what are the prospects for competition and cooperation by the U.S. and China in dealing with third world nations in Africa, South Africa, and South Asia?
Dim to non-existent from a practical perspective, though I can appreciate, let me say one thing. I spent some time with the World Bank, and it was around the time when the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was created. And at the time, a lot of people kind of read that as Beijing's attempt to kind of create a Chinese version of international development banks. In fact, there was a lot of practical cooperation. We did joint financing of several projects together. So there's always been, less kind of at the working level, less friction than you might think. That being said, I think, the politics are terrible on anything like that. And in fact, I think I would sort of make the argument that this kind of idea of competing for influence may be the best way to sort of think about that, maybe as a way to push for more adaptation financing from the US, China, and other major powers, to the extent that helping poor, vulnerable populations around the world become more resilient in the face of climate change can be thought of as part of competition for influence. I think it could be a productive outcome.
Okay, thank you for that. And we have time for one final question.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. Michael Weisberg from Arts and Sciences and Prairie World House. That last thing you said, of course, caught my attention, but I'm going to just file that away for discussion later. My question actually wanted to go back. You mentioned direct air capture. I just wondered, actually, do you know anything more broadly about what China's up to in that space or in solar radiation management? Because, I mean, if you look at what China says in multilateral forums about mitigation, a lot of times there's a lot of we need to, the word is often balance. So therefore we should talk about adaptation. One possibility is transparency is not their favorite thing, but another possibility is something's cooking. So I wondered if you have any insight on what might be cooking.
Okay, so I think there's nothing super promising out there that's cooking that's going to be world changing necessarily at the moment. Two things that are I think at least related though to your question. One, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration is a technology that should be much more prevalent than it is. And there are several reasons for that. Probably the biggest one is just the absence of a carbon price, but in any case, China has in many ways quite favorable geography for that technology. And there used to be quite a bit of cooperative work between the US and Chinese governments on demonstrating that. At the moment, the US is probably the leader in carbon capture, but from a demonstration perspective, China has some key advantages. And so that would seem to be an area where it would, make sense to pursue some cooperation. On the other hand, the more competitive side of things, nuclear power, another example of a technology that probably should be a bigger part of our decarbonization calculations than it is. Doesn't necessarily have to run on uranium, though all existing commercial reactors do. There are other so-called fuel cycles you could run on, one of which is based on an element called thorium. It has several advantages over uranium. There was a US experimental thorium reactor that shut down in 1969. 18 months ago, China announced that it would build one once again. And it would be very interesting. I mean, this is a decades off, sort of prospect, but if that effort could make thorium a commercial technology, it could be a very interesting part of the solution. And I think it's a good example of how, if we're not having kind of cooperation in this space, how do we, could we still find ways to make that development part of the global decarbonization puzzle?
Okay, so we are just about out of time. So I'm just going to do this a rapid round. So you have to give a short answer to this one,
Okay.
which is very briefly. 20th Party Congress just ended. Lots of news articles about it. Optimistic, pessimistic, indifferent, terrified. Give me a adjective.
Yeah, somewhere between pessimistic and terrified. I think from a foreign perspective, it's hard to come up with much that's that's uplifting from the 20th Party
Okay, well,
Congress.
we have a topic for our next talk, clearly. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. Can we give our panelists a round of applause? On a less terrifying note, and maybe more optimistic. So obviously, thank you all for joining us both here and those of you who are online. I found it very interesting that despite what you all just said about optimism or being terrified, that I take Scott's point that competition is more expensive than cooperation. And that's a pretty big point throughout all of this, as well as the fact that despite different values, that cooperation might, in fact, more cooperation might be possible. And that the climate change space is a space where you can test this out and where, in fact, it's being tested. And there might be opportunities for learning based on what's being done in the climate change space. So I leave here at least feeling moderately hopeful, I think. I also wanted to let the audience online and the audience here know that next Tuesday, we're going to have, speaking of nuclear power, a program on that's a part of the World Today that's going nuclear science, diplomacy, and defense. That's going to feature Lynn Mescal, who is a Penn professor, and that you all can view these programs online on Zoom, or pardon me, on YouTube, where you can find them a couple of days after we in fact have them. You can also follow us on every social media possible except for TikTok. And wanted to thank you again and to say that there's a grab and go lunch in the student lounge if you'd like some. So thank you, and another round of applause for our guests.